and welcome back to the channel. I am getting ready to work with this month's mixed media kit. There is this Tres Jolie MDF Cornucopia cut, a bag of texture powder, and 4 Stencil Butters in some beautiful fall colors. I am just going to work directly on the base. I'm not going to prepare it with any type of gesso. I want to make sure that I don't put too much on and fill in the details from the laser cutting on this cornucopia piece. So to start, I just used some painter's tape to mark off a border between the cornucopia basket and the pumpkin and the fruit and all the fillings that are spilling out of that, so that I could just come in, and I'm just using that chocolate stencil butter and brushing it on. I'm not putting it on thick right now. It's really kind of a base coat to get some base color in that I can build on. And with that base coat on there, I'm going to come back now and I'm going to try to build up a little bit, add a little bit of dimension and texture. And I'm just mixing in some of that texture powder with some of the chocolate stencil butter. And then I'm going to use small brushes, and I am going to carefully add it to the outside of the cornucopia basket. I guess it would be more like I'm adding it to the parts that I would see as the more raised section if this was a 3-dimensional basket. To help keep my mixture where I want it, I do just use an X-Acto knife. Because the blade is so thin, it helps me keep it out of the laser cut details, and I can push my mix around or push it back where it belongs. And there is the end of that. I'm just using a round brush to add some of that mix to the cornucopia filling, and a baby wipe to spread it out and lighten it a little bit, and then making sure that my edges are coated, and just using that chocolate stencil butter straight from the bottle just to brush around the edges. Because I use the baby wipe and I lighten it, the areas that are going to have that chocolate color on them, that will be in between the foliage and the pumpkin and the pear and the apple and the berries, it's going to be a different shade than in the cornucopia. I don't use any other mediums for color besides what came in the kit this month. It's all just a matter of how thick I put it on, or how much I rub off, or which ones I mix together, because I do mix a couple of the stencil butters together later on. To add a little bit of different coloring, different layering, I am mixing the eggplant with the terracotta stencil butters. They do mix together and they do make a brownish color. They just make a different brown than the chocolate. I add in a little bit of the fern stencil butter, and I just mix in a little bit of the colors a little bit at a time until I get a color that I'm happy with. And then I am just using this mix and spreading it across the entire bottom. I did not make a thorough mix on purpose. I was hoping that some streaks might show up, might come through of that fern or the eggplant. It gives a little bit of variation to the coloring. It doesn't make it so solid. I am just going to spread it across the cornucopia filling and work it in, and just add it as another layer on top of that chocolate with the texture powder mix that I had already put on there. And I just use a stiff brush. It helps keep those laser cut lines cleaned out so that I'll be able to see them as I add the details for that cornucopia filling. Any excess I have, I just use it lightly, add a little bit of extra shading on the cornucopia basket. And you can see how just using different shades of brown is already adding some dimension to this. All of my background stencil butter is completely dry now. And I'm just going to mix up some of that texture powder with some of the Fern Stencil Butter and use that for my fruit. Using that texture powder, besides adding texture, it also changes the look. It dulls some of the shine of that Stencil Butter so you can have a more matte finish. And I am just doing the same thing with this mix that I did with the chocolate for the Cornucopia basket. I'm using a couple of different brushes to spread that mix on to the apple and the pear. I am not putting the texture powder mix on the parts that would be where the shine is, the reflective light that would be on these pieces of fruit. And then I do start adding some of the green to the foliage that is also in that basket. And then just to give me a little bit of a different shading for my green, I mix in some of the eggplant Stencil Butter. It gives me a more muted tone of that fern green Stencil Butter, so it will allow me to add a little bit of extra shading and dimension on here. And to darken it up a little bit more, I add in some of the chocolate Stencil Butter and some of the terracotta Stencil Butter. And then I decided I wanted to try to add a little bit of shading to the Cornucopia basket, but not brush on something heavy. So I just put on a thin layer of that mix into a few spots and watered it down. And that just adds a little bit of extra color, but without really changing the overall color of that basket. And I'm just using a small brush and using the Fern Stencil Butter directly from the jar to fill in the areas that are those reflective surfaces of the fruit and to add a few shiny areas to the foliage. And for my pumpkin, I start with some of the terracotta Stencil Butter, mix in some of the texture powder, and fill in the larger sections of that pumpkin with the mix. And then since I had some left, I decided I wanted to add a watered down version to that Cornucopia basket. I really love layering up colors and not always having a plan of where they're gonna go, just to see how it comes out. But I do water it down quite a bit, and I do dab off a lot. I didn't want to make the whole basket a terracotta colored basket. I just wanted a little bit of that color on there. And then to fill in the smaller gaps on that pumpkin, I am using the terracotta directly from the jar. I brush it into the smaller gaps. I use my finger just to rub onto the surface a little bit so that pumpkin has a little bit more shine on it. I really liked how using my finger to rub it on added a very uneven coverage. I did the same thing on the Cornucopia basket with some of the terracotta, and then came in and did the same thing with some more of the chocolate. For the berries, I didn't want to brush them on. I didn't want them to be flat. I wanted to give them a little bit of that bubble that a berry would have or a grape would have. I first went out to my kitchen and I was trying to look and see what I had. I knew I had some cake decorating stuff around, but I had forgotten that at some point in time I had acquired this cheaper one with the plastic tips. There was only a couple tips for it, and I decided that this would work great for making those berries, because I can just pipe it on and then come back in and fix them if I needed to, shape them if I needed to. If you don't have a piping bag, you could easily just use a plastic bag. You could put your Stencil Butter into one corner of it and then just clip that corner and have a little throwaway baggie. So I just piped them on and then came back in and reshaped them, and I sprayed them with water, and I sprayed a little puddle of water to dip my finger in so I could use my finger to help smooth it. And keeping my finger wet, or keeping the surface of that Stencil Butter wet, kept that Stencil Butter from sticking to my finger, allowing me to smooth it better. So once I had all of them shaped the way I wanted, I came in and I used my heat gun. For once, I purposely was making my, more or less, Stencil Butter is just a texture paste, so I was purposely making my texture paste bubble. It helped re-round out any areas that might have become flattened, gave them a little extra volume. I didn't hold it in one place, I didn't want to burn it, but I did allow some bubbles to form and to push up and really give shape to those berries. After those berries had finished drying completely on their own, or at least were most of the way dry around the outside so that I could come in and add the stems, I mixed together some of the eggplant and some of the fern to create this brownish, greenish, purplish batch of Stencil Butter to come in and color in around those berries where the stems are. After I finished up the stems, I watered down that batch of Stencil Butter that I had mixed up and started adding it just to what would be the inside of the Cornucopia basket. I did it so just to add a little extra definition between the outside of that basket and the inside tunnel part. I used my heat gun, I used it on a low heat setting just so that I could dry it as I went along, see it how it was coming along, and get my layers up since I had this last bit of texture paste to work with. Since I had this last bit of Stencil Butter to work with. My Cornucopia is done, and I'm going to move on to my little metal word. This word came from a 3-pack of words I found at the Dollar Tree, and I didn't put any gesso on it. I wanted to see how well the Stencil Butter would work on the metal, so I just brushed on that mix. It was already there. It would add some color. I didn't care about having even coats. I do like that distressed look. I started with coating it with the leftover mixture, and then I set it to dry. Did not heat dry this. With it being on metal, it would have just peeled up. After that mix had air dried, I came in and I used a soft brush and I added some eggplant, and I just brushed it on lightly to about the top half of that metal word, and then just coated the back of it just so everything would blend in from both sides. All right, now for my assembly process. I used a couple of bars from hanging folders. They're sturdy, they're narrow. I didn't want them to really be a focal point. I wanted the stand to be a very minimal part of the entire project. So you can see I have one of the bars I bent in kind of a U shape. I just used a pair of jewelry pliers because they have the rounded ends to hold it, and then just bent it around the tip. And then I have these side cut pliers that they don't exactly cut through all the way on their own, but they do score enough that I can just finish wiggling it and get it to cut through. And so in this picture here, you can see what notches I am using on the bottom of this Cornucopia. This is where I have the edges of that metal hanger sitting in. To help stabilize the Cornucopia, I am using that other metal hanger that I had cut in half, and I will be gluing it up along the back. So to help fill in the gap between the bottom of the Cornucopia piece and the back of my bottom U-shaped stand part, I just curved up the ends of those two halves, and I am using some Gorilla Clear Grip to hold them in place. And this picture shows my final setup, how I have everything placed. And then I just let it sit and I leave it to dry before I come back and start working on more. I am just leaving the clips on just so those uprights won't fall over while I'm trying to work out the rest. I'm just trying to work out the distance I want between the cornucopia and my welcome. And so then after I get my distance worked out, after I get about where I'm going to be wanting to set that welcome, then I can come back in and I trim down the metal bars and I add a little curve to them just so they form the base of this piece. And then I just add my glue to them and weigh everything down to hold it still while I wait for that glue to set up. So with my base pieces mostly put together, I'm going to start attaching my cornucopia and the welcome and start trying to get everything finished up. To make sure that my cornucopia will stand up straight, I am going to lay everything down. I'm leaving those 2 bottom clips on. I don't want anything to shift at the bottom of this. So I'm building up some platform. That way I can lay my cornucopia on the uprights. I couldn't just lay it down because of the clips. So this is just what I worked out so that I could keep it flat and keep the clips on at the same time. I added some of that Gorilla Clear Grip to them. I added a little bit of protection between my gesso bottle that I'm using to help weigh that cornucopia down, make sure that it is sitting tight against those uprights. And then just let everything set and dry. I'm just using my gesso bottle to hold my cornucopia up so it doesn't tip over backwards right now. And then I am going to spread on my 3D matte gel in and around and fill in any gaps between the metal and the back of that cornucopia. I am just figuring out exactly where I want to line up that welcome across the front of the cornucopia. I do just sandwich that welcome in between a couple of acrylic blocks to hold it upright and to hold it in place while I wait for that 3D gel to set up. It's attached, but because it's only on that one corner, it is more of a pivot, so it kind of flaps around. I have just propped it up on a couple of bottle tops just to hold it straight. So I'm just mixing some of that chocolate stencil butter in with some of the texture powder. I am also adding in some of the 3D matte gel, not to change the color of the stencil butter, but to give it some extra adhesion because it is going on metal. And then I just start dabbing on. I'm not brushing it on smooth. I'm building it up, making sure that I have a good coat and good coverage across those metal hanging bars. I just work it up and cover up the uprights along the back and use it to fill in extra gaps. It has that 3D matte gel in it. It's just going to give it some extra hold, cover up that metal, blend everything together. And I'm only surface drying it right here. I am not drying it all the way. It's against metal, it would bubble. I have it on low heat. I just wanted to get the outer layer dry so that I could start adding my flowers. I just use a couple of jars again to stabilize that welcome. It is still basically only attached at the bottom of the C, and so 3D matte gel stays flexible, so it just sort of swings back and forth, and it's not a real thick hold right now. I knew I would be adding flowers, and so I would be using those flowers to help really hold that welcome in place by the time everything was said and done. Hopefully my hands don't get in the way too much. I am just going to try to try to work here, and just so you can see how I'm putting those flowers on, using the same 3D matte gel with them. It's a good, it has a good hold. And then after I get them in place, I am just going to set everything off and let it dry. And I do let this dry a couple of days just to make sure that that 3D gel had good time to set up. As I went along, the jars I was using to hold it up were in the way more than anything. And I realized that if I just put a couple of little clips at the very bottom, they make nice little feet. So that's what those two pink clips are for. They're just holding the welcome in place and keeping it from tipping over. And then I just use other clips to hold my flowers in place so that they quit trying to fall over backwards on me. And this is the final setup of everything, and now it's just a matter of waiting for it to dry. With everything dry, I am just going to come in now, and I'm going to use some of the chocolate with some of the texture powder and finish covering the rest of the base. I'm going to use a brush and just put a layer of that chocolate stencil butter across the entire back just to give it a nice finish. There were a couple of places on the welcome that I'm going to touch up because it did peel off from the clips I had been using. I'm just going to come in with some more of the fern and some of the eggplant and touch up the welcome. And now this is done. The only thing left is just to let all these touch-up areas finish drying. I hope that you enjoyed this project and it gave you some ideas of what you can do with this month's mixed media kit. All of the colors that I have on here are all made using just the mediums from the kit, just those 4 stencil butters. I used 3 of the burlap flowers from the scrapbooking kit, a little metal word that I had got at the Dollar Tree, and just some extra pieces of hanging file folder that I had laying around. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications if you haven't already. Give us a thumbs up and feel free to share this video. Thank you, and I will see you again next week.